So, in continuing our consideration of ADHD in the classroom, we need to think about ways that we as teachers can accommodate and help manage students who struggle with these issues. And I remember early in my career, this didn't happen inside a classroom, but a couple of friends of mine in about the same period of time approached me because they had some concerns related to their own child and things that they were hearing in the schools. And the first of these conversations happened with a man in my community. I know his family fairly well. And I happened to be in his office one day conducting some business. And he said that that particular day was a real exciting day for his family because his youngest son was finally getting ADHD medication. And was a little taken aback. And so I asked some questions, are there other things that you've done along the way? What other things have you tried to help your son in terms of behavior plans or different things that we could do at home or in the classroom? And he was really convinced that the medication was the magic wand that was going to solve all these problems. And I knew from my experience working that very rarely is medication the only answer, and certainly not, if it is the answer, not the sole answer to helping a student with ADHD accommodate for that concern within themselves. And I made the offer. These were friends of mine. I said, I could come over and talk to you guys and develop kind of some plans for you to use at home, and maybe even some things to talk to teachers about. But he was really resistant, really feeling that medication was the answer. Now, as time would move on, medication wasn't the only answer, and they were disappointed in that approach. Again, same period of time, a friend of mine who lives in Colorado gave me a call. He and his wife had a daughter. I think she was in the 5th grade at the time. And they had come back from a parent-teacher conference. And at that conference, the teachers suggested that perhaps their daughter had ADHD, and that was testing that they ought to encounter. And this man was pretty skeptical of the idea of ADHD and the medical community in general. And so he called me up and he said, what do you think about the school saying this? And this is another family I'd known for a long time. I'd stayed with them off and on in visiting Colorado. And I knew the child. And I said, well, what reasoning did the teacher have? And he said, well, they said that our daughter got out of her seat a lot, was kind of talking to her friends quite a bit, and not really engaged in academics as much as they would like. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, well, that, social butterfly, that sounds like a lot of pretty typical 5th, 6th grade young women in schools. And so I said, well, what do you guys see at home related to schoolwork? And I'd been to their home, right? They lived in this cabin at about 8,000 feet. Kind of west of Boulder, Colorado. It was about as close to heaven as I imagine we get here on Earth. And he said, well, she has a hard time like sitting at the dining room table, doing her homework. She's kind of always up. They had 2 giant husky dogs. She was always playing with the dogs. Then they also had a trail outside their backyard that led both up and down the mountain. And he says, we're always kind of finding her out on the trail with the dogs. And as he's saying this, I'm thinking to myself, well, if I lived where you live and I had 2 great dogs to be with, the kitchen table doing homework is kind of the last thing that I would want to be doing. And so to me, that didn't really sound a lot like ADHD. And I said, well, here's some things that you could try. And the thing at home was attention to being able to do homework, to being able to sit down and do homework for a long period of time. And I know that for me personally, I have about 15 minutes of really solid attention to a task that I don't want to do. I'm just as capable of spending 17 hours doing something and being upset when I have to get up to go to the bathroom if I'm really interested in what I'm doing. But if it's not something I really want to do, 15 minutes is kind of my limit. And so I try to construct my work so that I kind of work in 15-minute bursts. When we think about, this isn't related specifically to ADHD, but when we think about memory, if I were to read you or students a string of numbers and ask you, how many of 100 digits you could memorize just by hearing them. The typical human brain is going to remember the first 3 or 4 numbers and the last 3 or 4 numbers. Everything in the middle becomes mush. And I think the same is true of studying. When I talk to my college students about studying, we cram in college, and I'm certainly guilty of doing a lot of cramming, starting my homework at 11 o'clock at night and trying to prepare for a test the next day. And that's just not an effective way to study. Our brains are tired at night. We don't retain that information. Studying over a long period of time isn't a great idea. And so I try to talk to people about studying for 15 minutes, creating a space where the beginning and the end don't really have a middle. And 15 minutes seems to be the magic point for me as an adult. But for a young person, for this young woman, maybe starting with 5 minutes is a good idea. And so I had this man, we'll call him Steve. I had Steve and his wife create a schedule for their daughter where they used a kitchen timer, and she needed to work on homework for 5 minutes, and then she could have 5 minutes off. And after a couple weeks, then they increased. They went to 7 minutes, and then 9 minutes, and then 11 minutes, and then finally 15 minutes, and they kept the break at 5 minutes. And they really found that when they got to that 15-minute, 5 minutes, then Erin could be super productive in her work. And so after doing that for a while, they could kind of do away with the kitchen timer, that she had created the ability to have this attention to task. And she looked forward to getting out to the trail with the dogs. And so she'd come home and she'd work really hard and really efficiently through her work. And you think about it, I'm certainly guilty of this now, that when I'm in my office doing work, that if I work for 15 or 30 minutes, then I try to take a 5-minute break, and often that means reading about something on the internet, which quickly turns into a 20 or a 30-minute break. But if I have a real goal in mind and there's something else that I want to go do, for example, if I need to go to work on a Saturday just to get some emails answered, I get in, I get them done, and I get out, and I'm able to tackle a task that might have taken me twice as long when I wasn't super focused. So creating that space, creating that time, creating that focus can become a real advantage for those students. And it all just starts with that timer, right? 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, and then building up. One of the other concerns that we have about students with ADHD is that we're constantly correcting them. So if they're getting off task, we as teachers may have to say over and over and over again to our students, hey, you need to be on task, you need to get back to task. We may be using school-wide or classroom-based behavior plans where we're, in the old days when I was in school, it was my name being written on the board and then check marks after my name. I don't think my teacher ever just erased my name. I think she just left it up from day to day, knowing that, within the first 30 minutes my name was going on the board. I remember when my own daughter was in the 3rd grade, they used a clip system where they clipped up and clipped down. That was super effective for her. And so we may be using these other strategies alongside our students with ADHD, but we're constantly writing their names on the board, adding check mark, clipping down. And all of those result in negative interactions for the student. And they're not a lot of fun for us as teachers. And so one of the things that we can try to do is provide ways to remind our students to get back to task that don't actually involve us having a negative interaction with them. When we look at the power of negative interactions, we say that a negative interaction can be 7 to 14 times more powerful than a positive interaction. And so think about it. And probably none of you were the kinds of students that had to be interacted with negatively on a consistent basis. And, when we were just sort of crushed emotionally that our teacher thought negatively of us or had to correct some behavior. And so think of the student that's getting that feedback literally all of the time. If I have to correct a student 10 times within a day or a class period, I literally don't have time to go back and provide 70 positive interactions to try to counterbalance that. So anything that I can do to take myself out of that equation, the better. One of the methods that I've liked a lot over the years is we call it self-monitoring behavior. And if you Google self-monitoring behavior printable, you'll find some sheets that you can print out. And the ones that I like, it's just a sheet of paper and it's got columns of a smiley face, a neutral face, and a frowning face. And so I would print these off and I would laminate them and I would tape them down to a student's desk, and then they would have a whiteboard marker that they could use. And very rarely was I just targeting this at one single student. I'd often do it for the whole class. And it can work across any kinds of behaviors, but specifically off-task behavior. And so initially I was using it with a single student, and then you have to create some sort of cue, some way that the student is triggered to think, okay, am I on task? And if they are, they color in the smiley face. If they're not, they color in the frowny face. And if they're not sure, they color in the neutral face. And so back in the day, I had a tape recorder and a bell, and I created random tones with that bell into the tape recorder. And I had a super cheap portable cassette player. I think we called them Walkmans in the 80s, and some headphones before our earbuds, the headphones that went over our ears, little foam jobs. And I would have a student wear those headphones around their neck so they could just barely hear that tone. If I was working with a whole class, and today you can probably get an MP3 file. I know that you can buy CDs of random tones, and you might have that playing constantly for the whole class. Anytime that tone plays, then that's a cue for that student or the class to say, okay, am I insert behavior, and to make the correct coloring on their sheet. And then at the end of the day, you can have conversations with students about what their sheets look like. Now, an objection that I often get when I talk about this is, well, you can't really have a conversation about those things because students aren't going to be honest in how they inventory their own behavior. And my response to that is, I don't care. That's not a data collection point for me. That's not a tool I'm using to save behaviors or make decisions. It's a tool that I'm using so a student self-assesses, right? The student thinks to themselves, am I on task? And in thinking that, whether they happen to be on task at that moment or not, it's a reminder to get on task. And it's a reminder that I don't have to physically give. I don't have to say anything to the student. And so it takes me out of that role. It reduces those negative interactions, and it becomes systemic across the classroom. Again, this can work for any kind of behavior, but I think it's particularly helpful when it comes to off-task behavior. Another method that we might use, and again, this is counterproductive, but for students with ADHD, having something extra to do actually allows them to focus better in the classroom. I have a buddy, Nick. We've been friends for over 20 years, and he studied computer science in college, and he went to a college in Missouri, and I was at Benedictine, and every once in a while I'd drive down to visit with him, and I remember getting to his dorm room, and he would be, doing computer programming. That was his major. He'd be sitting in a hammock with his keyboard looking at a monitor, and he would have music playing on the stereo, and he would be watching The Simpsons over and over again on the television. And so here he was trying to do very technical work, listening to music, watching a television show while sitting in a hammock. There's no way I could do that, right? I would be so distracted and lost, I would get nothing done. But for him, someone with ADHD, that extra noise allowed him to really focus in. And so again, that doesn't seem like that makes sense. For those of us with non-ADHD brains, watching television or listening to music becomes a real distraction. But for the ADHD brain, it allows a lot of focus. Now, we can't have hammocks and The Simpsons and music in our classrooms, but what we can do is give our students what we would call a fidget. And so this is just something that the child can have in their hands and be playing with in the middle of class, and this actually helps them have more attention. So in my classrooms, I would always have a basket just on the kind of the file cabinet or whatever close to the entrance of the room that was full of fidgets, and we had rules for the fidgets, and basically the rule was I can't see it, I can't hear it, it doesn't distract anybody else. And so the kids who didn't need the fidget weren't able to sort of follow those rules, right? They would be distracted, and so they'd be throwing something in there, and I could see it, and then I'd ask them to put it back. But for the kid with ADHD, they were able to follow those rules. And whether that was self-awareness that I need this, so I'm going to do this the right way, or if it was just a happy byproduct, I don't know, but I'm happy to run with happy byproducts. And so, it could be silly putty, it could be a jack, it could be a squish ball, it could be a stress ball, any of those little things. And just having the child with that in their hands can be a real benefit. Sometimes you'll see in classrooms that teachers have put big rubber bands around the front legs of a student's chair, and the student can kind of get their leg in the rubber band and bounce, and that's helpful. That's a very inexpensive option. You can also purchase, I see them around now, they're like cushions that go in the student's chair that are inflated, sort of whoopee cushions without the sounds, because the air stays in. And that provides the student just kind of the ability to rock and move around in their chair, and that can be very helpful. There was a period of time where we were using exercise balls as seats in classrooms, and that's another thing that we can allow students to do. So they're just like burning that extra energy. I don't know the brain science or the physiology of why it works, but it does work. So we keep doing that. So having that extra thing, having that fidget. Another thing to think about is, especially for you teachers in the junior high and high school levels, is that sometimes a student with ADHD, this also works for students with auditory processing disorders, we'll talk about that later, they can't listen and take notes at the same time. So if you're a teacher that's working on note-taking skills with your students, you're giving, lectures, short lectures, long lectures, where you're asking students to take notes, they can't always pay attention and take notes at the same time. And so there's lots of ways that we can help students with that. In a college classroom, we might formally set up a situation where a very good note taker shares his or her notes with the student who struggles with attention. Or I might provide my notes for the lecture to the student ahead of time. The thing that I really like to do, if I'm using, say, PowerPoint or Keynote, you can print out slides where you put 3 slides on a page, and then there's lines to write next to those slides. And I'll often email those to students ahead of time so that they can print them out if that becomes an effective way for them to both pay attention and take notes. One of the things that we're working on, again, dating the videos in the age of COVID, is how do we create a hybrid model of learning? And for me, that's going to be recording some things and putting them online for students to watch, much like you may be engaging in this content now. And when we put documents up into YouTube, YouTube automatically transcribes them. And so there can be a transcript of what we're doing. And so being able to provide both the audio and the visual and the transcript may be something that helps these students quite a lot. So those are a couple methods of why, sort of why and how we work with students with ADHD. Medication is not the only answer. I think a lot of people are able to learn to accommodate for those differences without medication, but for some people, medication is a really valuable tool in the process of managing ADHD. And so I don't have a position. I'm not pro-med, anti-med. I'm pro the right tools for the child, and that varies from individual to individual. But at least part of the work needs to come from things that we do in the home and in the classroom to make the academic curriculum a little more accessible to these folks.